The light faded, and Yeho found himself standing before a being of impossible beauty and terror. The elder shifted through forms like water flowing through different containers, and one moment, it was a great bird with wings of pure light, and next, it was a tall humanoid figure with eyes like galaxies, and then it was something that had no name in any human language, and throughout all these changes, its attention remained fixed on Yeho. A human has learned of our existence, the elder said, and its voice was the sound of wind through ancient trees. And protocol is clear, and his memories must be erased, and he must be relocated to prevent contamination of his species. No. Yura cried, and she stepped forward despite her wounds. And you cannot do this, and he saved my life, and he protected me when he had nothing to gain, and he fought a Vexari with nothing but courage. Courage is irrelevant, the elder said, and its forms continued to shift and flow, and protocol exists for reasons beyond the understanding of the young, and we have protected Earth for 10,000 years by following these rules without exception. Yeho listened to this exchange, and he felt fear coiling in his stomach, but beneath the fear was something else, and it was the same feeling he had when he faced the men who had threatened him years ago. And it was the same feeling he had when he carried Yura through the frozen mountains. It was the feeling of knowing who he was. May I speak? Yeho said, and his voice did not tremble. The elder turned its attention to him, and the weight of 10,000 years pressed down on his shoulders, and he felt very small and very human and very fragile. Speak, the elder said. Yeho took a breath. And he did not argue, and he did not beg, and he simply told the truth. I am a veterinarian, he said, and I care for wounded animals, and I have been doing this work for 10 years, and in that time, I have saved hundreds of creatures, and I have also lost many, and I have held them as they died, and I have mourned them, even though they were not human. The elder watched him with eyes that had seen civilizations rise and fall. 3 weeks ago, I found a hawk in my yard, Yeho continued, and it was wounded in ways I did not understand, and my training told me it should be dead, but it was not dead, and so I helped it, and that is all I did, and I did not know it was not a bird, and I did not know it would change. My life and I simply saw something in pain, and I answered. He paused and looked at Yura, and she was crying silently, and her tears fell like stars. That is what I do, Yeho said. And that is what humans do, and we see suffering, and we answer, and we do not ask if the creature is useful or valuable or worthy, and we simply help because helping is right and because suffering deserves an answer. The elder was silent, and its form slowed and settled into something almost human, and it said, You believe this defines your species. I believe it defines the best of us, Yeho said. And I believe it is why we are worth protecting, and not because we are powerful or advanced or useful, but because we care about things that cannot repay us. The silence stretched, and Yeho felt the elder examining him in ways he could not comprehend, and he stood firm, and he did not look away. Finally, the elder spoke. In 10,000 years of observation, it said, I have rarely encountered a species that extends its protective instincts so freely, and I have watched humans wage terrible wars and commit great cruelties, and yet I have also watched them risk their lives for animals and strangers, and beings they will never see again. The elder's form settled and became something almost kind. Perhaps, it said, the old protocols were written for a universe without humans, and perhaps it is time to consider new ways. Yura gasped, and her hand found Yeho's, and she held on tight. The Vexari will be driven from this system, the elder said. And you, Yeho, will keep your memories in your home and your life, and you will be designated a guardian contact and permitted to know the truth of the universe. What does that mean? Yeho asked. It means you will be a bridge, the elder said. And you will stand at the boundary between Earth and the galaxy, and you will protect your world in ways your people cannot know, and it is a heavy burden. Yeho looked at Yura, and she smiled through her tears, and he said, I have carried heavy Burdens before and this one I choose. The elder nodded and light filled the clearing. And when it faded, the elder was gone, and the Vexari soldier was gone, and only Yeho and Yura remained on the frozen peak. Months later, Yeho sat on the porch of his rehabilitation center and watched the sunset paint the mountains gold and red, and he heard the cry of a hawk above him and smiled. Yura landed beside him and shifted into her human form, and she was healthy now and strong, and her eyes still held colors that had no names, but they also held something new and warm. The foxes are recovering well, she said, as she sat beside him. And the young hawk will be ready to release next week. Good, Yeho said, and he leaned back in his chair and felt the peace settle over him. Yeho, Yura said, and her voice was soft and curious. I have been thinking about what you said to the elder, and about how humans help things that cannot repay them, and I still do not fully understand it. Yeho was quiet for a moment, and then he said, When I was young, my father found an injured dog by the road, and it was old and sick, and it would never be able to work or play or do anything useful, and my mother asked why he would waste time on such a creature. Yura listened with attention. In her strange, beautiful eyes, my father said that the value of a life is not measured by what it can give you. Yeho continued, and he said that compassion is not a transaction, and it is not something you spend and expect to get back, and it is simply what you do when you see something that needs you. And you believed him, Yura said. I became him. Yeho said, and he smiled. Yura reached out and took his hand, and she said, I am still learning what it means to be human, and I think I will be learning for a very long time. Take all the time you need. Yeho said. They sat together and watched the stars appear one by one, and somewhere out there among those lights, the galaxy continued its ancient dance of chaos and order, and among all those countless worlds, there was only one Earth, and only one species that would rescue wounded strangers in storms, and Yeho would be there to answer when the wounded called, because that was who he was, and it always would be. The mountains were cruel in winter, and the cold bit through their clothes, and the paths were treacherous with ice, and every step was a battle against nature itself. But Yeho had walked these trails for 3 years, and he knew them like he knew his own heartbeat, and he led Yura through the dense forest with careful confidence as she followed him with trust in her eyes. When they needed to scout ahead, Yura shifted into a small bird and flew above the treetops and searched for danger. But each transformation drained her, and after a few minutes she would fall from the sky, and Yeho would catch her and carry her until her strength returned. You are pushing yourself too hard, Yeho said on the second day, and he held her in his arms as she trembled with exhaustion. I must be useful, Yura said, and her voice was weak, and I cannot let you carry all the burden. Partners share burdens, Yeho said, and they do not keep score, and they simply help each other. Yura looked at him with something like wonder, and she said, Partners, and is that what we are? I do not know what else to call it, Yeho said, and he smiled despite the fear that gnawed at his chest. On the third day, they saw the Vexari for the first time. Yeho was leading them through a narrow valley, when Yura grabbed his arm and pulled him down behind a fallen tree, and she pointed to the ridge above them, and Yeho looked, and his blood turned to ice. 3 figures stood on the ridge, and they were tall and angular and wrong in ways that hurt to look at, and their bodies moved like insects wearing the skins of mammals, and their heads swiveled in patterns that no natural creature would use, and their eyes were empty black pits that reflected no light. Do not move. Yura breathed, and her hand gripped his arm so hard it hurt. And do not even breathe. They lay frozen in the snow, and the Vexari scanned the valley below, and Yeho could hear a faint clicking sound that seemed to come from inside his own head. And it was their communication, and it was horrible and alien, and it made him want to scream. But he did not move, and he did not breathe, and after an eternity, the Vexari turned and moved away. Along the ridge, they are hunting in patterns, Yura said when they were gone. And they are searching systematically, and we cannot outrun them forever. We do not need forever, Yeho said, and his voice was calm despite the terror in his heart. And we only need to reach the beacon. He led them on a different path, and it was longer and harder, but it kept them away from the Vexari patrol routes, and Yeho used everything he knew about the forest to keep them hidden. He led them through a bear's territory because he knew the large male would investigate any intruders, and the Vexari would have to deal with him first, and he heard the roar of confrontation behind them as they slipped away. He guided them across a frozen stream where the ice was thin because he knew exactly where to step, and when the Vexari tried to follow, he heard the crack and splash of their pursuit ending in the freezing water. He brought them through dense thickets where birds nested in huge numbers because he knew their sensors would be overwhelmed by thousands of small life signs. How do you know these things? Yura asked as they rested in a small cave on the fourth night. Yeho was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "When I left the city, I spent a year hiding from the world, and there were people who had hurt an animal in my care, and when I tried to stop them, they threatened me and my family, and I was afraid for a long time." Yura watched him with soft eyes, and she waited for him to continue. "I learned to be invisible," Yeho said, "and I learned to move without being seen, and I learned to use the forest as a shield, and I thought I was being a coward, but now I think maybe I was just preparing." "You are not a coward," Yura said, and her voice was fierce. "And you are the bravest being I have ever known." On the fifth day, they reached the beacon site, and it was a small clearing on a remote peak, and the air was thin and cold. And Yeho could see for miles in every direction, but they were not alone. A single Vexari soldier stood in the clearing, and it had been waiting for them, and its black eyes fixed on Yura, and it made a sound that was like laughter but wrong and broken. "Run," Yura said, and she pushed Yeho behind her. "No," Yeho said, and he stepped forward beside her. The Vexari attacked, and it moved faster than anything Yeho had ever seen, and its limbs extended, and weapons emerged from its body and geometric patterns. A fire burned through the air. Yura shifted and tried to fight, but she was too weak, and the Vexari struck her down, and she cried out in pain and fell to the frozen ground. Yeho did not think, and he simply acted, and he pulled the emergency tranquilizer from his pack, and it was loaded with enough sedative to bring down a bear, and he ran at the Vexari with nothing but desperation in his heart. The creature turned toward him, and its arm rose to strike, and Yeho dove under the blow and drove the needle into the joint where the leg met the body, and he pressed the plunger and emptied every drop of the sedative into the alien's body. The Vexari screamed, and it was a sound that would haunt Yeho's dreams for years, and it staggered, and its movements became slow and uncoordinated, and it fell to its knees. Yeho grabbed Yura and pulled her toward the beacon, and she activated it with trembling hands, and a pulse of light shot into the sky, and the Vexari crawled toward them with murder in its eyes. "Come on," Yeho whispered, and he watched the sky and prayed to whatever gods might listen. A response came, and light filled the clearing, and a voice spoke in a language Yeho did not understand, but when Yura's face went pale with shock, he knew that something was wrong. "It is not my people who answered," she said, and her voice was hollow with fear. "And it is the Elder Council, and they will take you away, and I am so sorry." The light descended, and Yeho held Yura's hand and faced whatever was coming with his heart pounding in his chest. 3 weeks passed, and Yeho's life became something strange and wonderful and terrifying. All at once, Yura healed slowly, and her wounds closed, and her strength returned, but her shape-shifting abilities remained weak, and she could not hold an animal form for more than a few minutes before exhaustion forced her back to her human shape, and so she stayed as she was and learned to be human. Yeho taught her how to use a phone and how to cook simple food and how to bow to elders and all the small customs that made up daily Korean life, and she absorbed everything with a hunger that surprised him, and she asked questions about things he had never thought to question. "Why do you feed the birds even in winter?" she asked one morning, and she stood beside him as he filled the feeders outside his window. "And they are not your patients, and you gain nothing from them. They are hungry," Yahoo said, and he did not understand why she found this confusing. "But they are not useful to you," Yura said. "And they take your resources and give nothing in return. And among my people, this would be considered foolish." Yahoo smiled and said, "Maybe it is foolish, and maybe I do not care." Yura watched him for a long moment, and then she helped him fill the rest of the feeders, and she did not ask again. In the evenings they sat together, and Yura told him about the galaxy and the hundreds of species that lived among the stars, and the great empires that rose and fell, and the wars that burned across solar systems. And Yahoo listened with wonder and sadness and sometimes fear. "Why do the Myrae protect Earth?" he asked one night. And the question had been growing in him for days. "And why risk yourselves for a species you have never met?" Yura was quiet for a long time, and then she said, "Because you are rare and precious, and you do not know it." She explained that most species in the galaxy evolved alone, and they developed intelligence in isolation, and they saw other life forms only as resources or threats, and the concept of bonding with another species was alien to them in the truest sense of the word. "But humans are different," Yura said, and her voice held something like reverence. "And you domesticate animals, and you mourn them when they die. And you rescue wounded hawks in storms, and you build centers to heal creatures that will never repay you in this capacity for cross-species. Bonding is almost unique in the known universe." Yahoo had never thought of humanity this way, and he said, "We just care about animals, and that seems normal to me." "That is exactly why you are worth protecting," Yura said, and she smiled, and it was the first time he had seen her smile. But the peace could not last. On the 19th day, Yura received a message, and it came through a small device hidden in her body. And it was fragmented and broken and filled with static, but the meaning was clear. Another Myrae had sent a warning, and the Vexari had landed a ground team, and they were moving through the region and capturing wildlife and dissecting anything that showed unusual readings. And they were getting closer every day. "I have to leave," Yura said, and her face was pale and determined. "And there is a beacon hidden in the mountains, and if I can reach it, I can call for rescue." "You are not fully healed," Yahoo said, and he felt something cold grip his heart. "It does not matter," Yura said. "And I cannot stay here and bring destruction to your door, and you have already done more for me than anyone has ever done." Yahoo stood and walked to his closet, and he pulled out his hiking pack and his boots and his warmest jacket. And Yura watched him with confusion in her eyes. "What are you doing?" she asked. "I am coming with you," Yahoo said, and he began to pack supplies. "No," Yura said, and her voice was sharp with fear. "And you do not understand the danger, and the Vexari will kill you without hesitation, and humans who learn about alien life are sometimes silenced by galactic authorities." "Silenced?" Yahoo asked, and he paused in his packing. "Removed," Yura said quietly, "and your memories would be erased, and you might be taken off-world, and you would never see your home again." Yahoo considered this, and then he continued packing, and he said, "You are not strong enough to make the journey alone, and you know this, and I know this, and we both know that you need my help. Why would you risk everything for me?" Yura asked, and her voice trembled. "And I am a stranger, and I am not even human." Yahoo stopped and looked at her, and he said, 3 weeks ago I found a wounded hawk, and I did not know what it was or where it came from, and all I knew was that it needed help, and I gave it help because that is who I am, and nothing has changed." Yura stared at him, and tears formed in her strange eyes, and she said, "I will never understand humans. You do not have to understand us, Yeho said. And you only have to trust us. They left at dawn, and the mountains rose before them, cold and vast and dangerous, and somewhere behind them, the Vexari were closing in, and they did not know that they had already found the rehabilitation center. They did not know that the hunters had discovered the feathers that Yeho had never cleaned up. They did not know that time was running out faster than either of them could imagine, but they walked forward anyway, because that was what courage looked like. And sometimes it was not about being unafraid, and sometimes it was about walking into the unknown because someone needed you, and Yeho had always answered when the wounded called. The woman woke on the second day, and Yeho was there with water and soup and questions that burned in his chest like fire. She sat up slowly, and the blanket fell from her shoulders, and she looked around the small room with those impossible eyes. And when she saw Yeho, she did not seem surprised. "You did not call others," she said, and her Korean was broken but understandable, and her voice had a strange quality like many voices speaking at once in perfect harmony. "No," Yeho said, and he handed her the water, and she drank it all in one long swallow, and he asked the question he had been holding for 2 days. "What are you?" She was silent for a long moment, and then she said, "My people call ourselves the Myray, and we have watched your world for many of your centuries, and we are what your stories might call shapeshifters." Yeho sat down heavily in his chair, and his legs felt weak, and his mind felt like it was splitting apart, and he said, "That is not possible. And yet here I am," she said, and she held up her hand, and Yeho watched as her fingers stretched and changed and feathers sprouted from her skin, and then reversed and became human again, and he felt like he might be sick. "My name is too long for human mouths," she said, "but you may call me Yura, and I am sorry that I have brought danger to your door." "What danger?" Yeho asked, and even as he spoke, he knew that he should be afraid, but he was not, and all he felt was a deep need to understand. Yura told him everything she told him about the Vexari, and how they were a parasitic species that hunted the Myray across the galaxy and harvested them for their genetic material, and she told him how she had been fleeing a Vexari hunting ship when she crashed near his home, and she told him the worst truth of all: the Vexari do not know about Earth, she said, and her voice was heavy with fear. "And my people have protected your world by keeping it secret, but now the Vexari have followed me here, and if they find me, they will also find humanity, and your species is not ready to face them." Yeho felt cold spread through his body, and he asked, "What would they do to us?" "They would take what they wanted," Yura said, and her eyes darkened with memories. "And your people would not be able to stop them, and millions would die, and millions more would be taken, and Earth would become a harvesting ground." The weight of her words pressed down on Yeho, and he wanted to run, and he wanted to hide, and he wanted to pretend that none of this was real, but he looked at Yura and saw the fear and pain in her eyes, and he knew he could not abandon her. "How do we hide you?" he asked, and Yura stared at him with something like shock on her face. "You would help me," she said, and her voice trembled. "Even knowing what you now know, and even knowing the danger, you came to me for help," Yeho said simply, and that was all the explanation he had, and all the explanation he needed. Yura studied him for a long moment, and then she said, "Among my people, self-preservation is the highest law, and we do not risk ourselves for strangers, and I do not understand you. Maybe that is why you needed to find a human," Yeho said, and he was surprised by his own words, and he stood and walked to the window and looked out at his quiet mountain home, and he asked, "What do the Vexari look for?" "My biosignature," Yura said, "and it is unique to my species, and their scanners can detect it from orbit." Yeho thought about this, and an idea began to form in his mind, and he turned to Yura and said, "Your signature, and is it different from animal signatures?" "Yes," Yura said, "but only in ways their scanners are programmed to detect. What if we surrounded you with other signatures? Yeho said, and his heart beat faster as the plan took shape. And what if we created so much noise that they could not find your signal? He led Yura through his rehabilitation center and showed her the cages and enclosures where his animals were covered. And there were hawks and owls and foxes and deer and rabbits and dozens of other creatures, and Yura's eyes widened. And she understood. You want to hide me among them, she said. Not just among them, Yeho said, but at the center of them, and if I move all the enclosures closer together and put you in the middle, then maybe their scanners will see only a blur of life signs. Yura shook her head slowly and she said, this is crude and unscientific and it should not work. But she helped him anyway, and they spent hours moving cages and building a dense circle of animal life around the small back room, and by nightfall, Yura sat in the center of a living shield, made of wounded creatures that Yeho had saved. The night came, and with it came a feeling of wrongness that settled over the mountain, and the animals grew restless and paced in their cages, and Yeho felt something cold brush against his thoughts. They are scanning, Yura whispered, and her face was pale, and her hands were shaking. The sky above the mountain lit up with a faint purple glow, and Yeho held his breath, and the animals cried out in fear, and Yura closed her eyes and waited. And then the glow passed and moved on and faded into the distance. It worked, Yura said, and her voice was filled with wonder. And your impossible human plan worked. But her face remained grim, and she looked at Yeho with eyes that held a terrible knowledge, and she said, they will return, and now they know a Mirai is somewhere on this planet, and they will not stop searching until they find me. Yeho sat beside her, and he was tired and afraid, and facing something far beyond his understanding, but he did not regret his choice, and he said, then we will be ready for them. Yura looked at him, and for the first time something other than fear appeared in her strange eyes, and it might have been hope, or it might have been gratitude, or it might have been something she did not yet have. A name, for outside the window the stars shone cold and distant, and somewhere among them the hunters were circling back. The storm came without warning that night, and it brought something Yeho would never forget. Rain fell in heavy sheets across the mountains of Gangwon province, and the wind screamed through the trees like a wounded animal, and Yeho sat alone in his small wildlife rehabilitation center and listened to the chaos outside. He was a veterinarian who had left the busy city life 3 years ago, and now he spent his days caring for injured birds and foxes and deer and any creature that needed help, and he found peace in this simple work, even though his family thought he was wasting his talent. The power flickered twice and then died completely, and Yeho grabbed his flashlight and walked to the window, and that was when he heard it. A sound that did not belong to the storm. It was a cry unlike anything he had ever heard in his 10 years of working with animals, and it was sharp and desperate and filled with something that sounded almost like words. He pulled on his rain jacket and stepped outside into the howling wind, and the beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, and he followed the sound to the back of his property where the old oak tree stood. And there beneath the tree he found it, a hawk lay on the wet ground, and its wings were spread at wrong angles, and its feathers were soaked with rain and something else. And when Yeho knelt beside it, he felt his heart stop for a moment. The bird was covered in wounds, but they were not wounds from any predator. He knew, and they were not cuts or bites or scratches. Instead, they were burns in perfect geometric patterns, like someone had pressed hot metal shapes into the creature's body. What happened to you? Yeho whispered, and he carefully lifted the hawk and cradled it against his chest. And the bird should have fought him, because wild hawks always fought when humans touched them, but this one simply looked at him with eyes that held too much awareness. He carried the bird inside and placed it on his examination table, and he worked through the night to clean the strange wounds and stabilize the creature, and by morning he had done everything he could. And the hawk was still alive, but it should not have been alive. Yeho had seen hundreds of injured birds in his career, and he knew what wounds a body could survive, and these wounds were beyond survival. And yet the hawk breathed, and its heart beat, and its strange eyes watched him with a nice intelligence that made him uncomfortable. Over the next 3 days, Yeho cared for the hawk, and he fed it and cleaned its wounds and spoke to it softly, and with each passing hour his unease grew stronger. The bones beneath the feathers did not feel right, and when he touched the bird's wing structure, he felt something that was almost like bone, but not quite, and the texture was wrong, and the weight was wrong, and everything was just slightly different from what a hawk should be, and the wounds healed too fast. Burns that should have taken weeks to show improvement were closing in days, and new feathers were already pushing through the damaged skin, and Yeho told himself that he was tired and that his mind was playing tricks on him, but deep inside he knew that something was very wrong. On the third night, he fell asleep in the chair beside the treatment room, and he dreamed of stars and ships and creatures that wore different faces, and when he woke at midnight, he heard sounds from beyond the door, sounds that could not come from a bird. He stood slowly, and his heart pounded in his chest, and he walked to the door and pushed it open, and his flashlight fell from his hand and clattered on the floor. The hawk was gone. In its place, a young woman lay crumpled on the cold tiles, and she was unconscious and barely breathing. And she wore no clothes, and her skin was covered in the same geometric burns that had marked the bird, and feathers were scattered all around her like fallen leaves. Yoho stood frozen, and his mind refused to accept what his eyes were showing him, and he watched as the woman's chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, and he saw the burns pulse with faint light, and he understood that nothing in his life had prepared him for this moment. But he was still a healer. He grabbed a blanket from the cabinet and covered the woman, and he knelt beside her and checked her breathing and her pulse and her temperature, and he did all the things he would do for any patient because that was who he was. The woman's eyes opened suddenly, and Yeho gasped and stumbled backward because her eyes were not human eyes, and the irises shifted through colors that had no names, and they swirled like oil on water, and they held depths that seemed to go on forever. She looked at him, and he saw fear in those impossible eyes, and he saw pain and exhaustion and desperation, and then she spoke a single word in Korean that was heavily accented and broken. Hide. Her eyes closed again, and she went limp, and Yeho sat on the cold floor beside her, and his hands were shaking, and his thoughts were racing, and he did not know what to do. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever this woman was, and wherever she had come from, and whatever had hurt her so badly, she had come to him for help, and he could not turn away from someone in need, and that was not who he was, and it never would be. He lifted her carefully and carried her to the small bed in his back room, and he dressed her wounds with gentle hands, and he covered her with warm blankets, and he sat beside her and waited for her to wake again. The storm had passed, and the morning sun was beginning to rise, and somewhere in the distance a real hawk called out its hunting cry, and Yeho looked at the sleeping woman and knew that his quiet life in the mountains was over. He did not know that hunters were coming, and he did not know that this woman's people had protected Earth for centuries, and he did not know that his simple act of kindness would change the fate of his entire species. All he knew was that she needed help, and he would give it. And in that moment, that was enough.